Enter the world of M.R. James's ghost stories and you step into an atmosphere of terror waiting to happen.
First of all, you get these sort of sensual, these kind of sensations coming at you. Clammy, hairy, sticky, mouldy. These are sort of sensual characteristics.
They were inexplicable elemental beings that James had no intention of attempting to explain.
There's the physical sort of clammy sensation when these things arrive, and that's it. It's just a flash. He called it a flash, and then it's gone.
What's the matter?
But it isn't just the physical nature of James's demons that make his stories so haunting. He creates a mood of psychological uneasiness, often through the use of landscapes which menace and destabilize his characters.
I think the essence of what makes M.R. James brilliant is its peripheral horror.
Things go on in the corner of the retina. I think this is very important with James. You can't quite see it.
If you strip away the effects and the fictional veneer, what's going on underneath is this sense that there is something in this universe, there are things in this universe that we cannot explain and that we will never be able to explain and that we should not be able to explain.
James only produced some 30 ghost stories in his lifetime, but they have earned him a reputation as one of the world's greatest supernatural storytellers. Writing at the very beginning of the 20th century, his work has been a major influence on the modern horror genre and widely adapted for television and film.
I think he opened up a seam of dark consciousness that modern authors and filmmakers have drawn deeply on.
This is the story of an unlikely revolutionary who unknowingly changed the face of horror. A deeply conservative Cambridge don who only started writing ghost stories to entertain his friends, but who stumbled upon new and enduring ways to make our flesh creep. Montague Rhodes James spent most of his life as an academic at King's College, Cambridge. He first read his ghost stories to a group of friends called the Chit Chat Society, but his storytelling soon became an annual event. At Christmas, James would invite friends and selected students to his drawing room, where candlelight and an open fire provided the perfect setting for what he always called his entertainments. A Victorian trapped in the modern world, James never took himself seriously as a writer.
He wrote to entertain, and he wrote, I suppose, quite quickly. And this gives us this feeling that there's a sort of spontaneity, there's a sort of feeling that he's sitting down with his friends and saying, well, I've got something to tell you.
Seaborough, on the east coast, a long seafront and a street.
He wrote them to be read out loud, so often the narrator will become the character, and there's a little kind of pauses of humour that you absolutely know that are in there because he's going to elicit a laugh from his audience following a piece of terror. As we know, those two things are very closely entwined.
That's a very curious matter. But I don't know whether a gentleman like yourself is interested in our old stories. Oh, yes, I said. He told me, the rector.
A very good actor. He was a very good mimic. I think he probably delivered them very well indeed.
Eager. And, of course, he happened...
I suspect he put on voices. I think almost certainly he, particularly for the sort of low-life characters, I think he would probably have probably relished doing those voices. So I think they were probably quite dramatic readings. I don't think they were solemn in any way. I think he probably lived the parts, and I think they were probably quite theatrical.
There is a sort of feeling that they are entertainments as opposed to art, which isn't to put it down. I mean, and quite often entertainments can be very, very revealing, as I think some of his stories are. But he was writing for effect. He was writing ghost stories, I think, in the way that people tell jokes, to get a reaction. And maybe being scared isn't the same as laughing, or maybe on some ways it is.
Such reactions were provoked by James's conjuring tricks with supernatural demons, which broke the mould of conventional terror.
His ghosts seem more often to be, demons or creatures from another dimension.
Rather than the white-sheeted, skull-headed creature or something carrying its head in its arms that we think of.
Or just a bad feeling.
There's a typical James manifestation is not so much a ghost as some sort of horrible thing that seems to have had its origins in the ruins of Nineveh.
It is interesting how he has it both ways. It's sort of in the corner of the eye, but when it comes, for a moment, it's very physically described. You just get a sense it's there, and you're never the same again, and your hair goes white, and you stop overreaching in your research, or whatever the moral of the tale is. And remember, as he tells these stories, they're handing round the anchovy toast, and the claret, and the snuff. It's a Christmas joke in an academic community. And part of that put down is that it was a jolly jape. I mean, I'm prepared to accept there's much more serious things really going on, but James thought of ghost stories as a Christmas gag.
James had grown up in an era when telling ghost stories was a much-loved part of a traditional Victorian Christmas. As a child, the work of Charles Dickens particularly caught his imagination.
Most of the iconography of Christmas comes through in the 1840s and 1850s, and part of that is sitting at home reading the ghost story, hence Christmas Carol.
Hello. What do you want with me?
I suppose you don't really think of A Christmas Carol as a ghost story, but it is. I mean, it's explicitly, they're called the ghosts of Christmas past and future.
Am I that man who lay upon the bed? Oh, no, Spinito, no.
And it was such a big hit that Dickens then wrote a couple more, because he was a magazine publisher. So he would put his spooky story in the Christmas issue. They sold in enormous quantities, the Christmas supplements often consisting entirely of ghost stories. And these were not only read, they were read probably aloud in family groups around the fire. So James is drawing, I think, also on this tradition as well, of the oral telling of stories. I mean, that is, as old as time.
I suppose it's fear as the other side of joy. You've got the joyful Christmas message. But the other side of joy is sort of gloom, so it kind of reminds you of that. It's winter, it's early evenings, it's pre-central heating, so you're all huddled indoors, together. Storytelling is a much more common thing. I think there's a whole cluster of reasons why, but it was well established by James's time that you do a nasty story at Christmas.
Nothing more could be discovered about Paxton. And so the legal business reached, so to speak, a dead end.
James didn't have to look far to find the inspiration for his characters. They not only reflect his own scholarly personality, but also his antiquarian passions.
It's impossible to have an M.R. James story that doesn't include some dusty, old, single bachelor scholar going in search for something and uncovering dreadful, mysterious and largely terrifying things. But in that case, his characterisation is perfect, because by reading M.R. James' collected works, you feel you know him, because he is almost in every story.
We are not entered into this investigation for any motive of gain or greed.
I had thought of scientific inquiry.
If I were thought by my host here, by anyone, to be a mere treasure hunter...
Your reputation as a scholar.
Exactly.
It's always about these people who live, closeted, academic, dry, affectless lives, people who are happiest spending all their times in libraries looking things up.
This is a world where men are purely interested in the curiosity and the discovering and the exploration of things past.
He looks down from on high to see what is hidden. Are you still not reminded of anything?
It's almost as if he's taking his own character and putting himself into what-if situations.
Well, I'll leave you with it. I trust you'll keep me informed should you discover anything of interest.
The BBC seized on the visual nature of James's work in the 1960s, when it started a new tradition of annually adapting ghost stories for Christmas.
So it was a wonderful thing the BBC did with the M.R. James ghost stories at Christmas. I mean, it was absolutely just lived for them. It was the most exciting thing. And of course, you had no videotape in there to record, so you actually had to be present. And so it had a real feeling of an event.
Instead of the narrator figure of James sitting in his rooms in King's reading them to his select group of friends, you have your television in the corner of the room, and there you all are, gathered round the fire, I hope, with your family, watching the adaptations on television. I think he would have been rather pleased at that.
Maybe the thing that works for James on television is they're simple stories. They distill very nicely into 3/4 of an hour or half an hour.
Agar was the name. William Agar. Do you mind if I look? Well, by all means. It's very overgrown in that corner, I'm afraid.
He was a writer who understood suspense and a great storyteller. Great storyteller can hold his or her audience in their hand. He can make them laugh when he wants to, make them cry, make them jump, and James could do all those things. They frightened me, they were intensely visual, and revealed their plots gradually and in an extraordinarily intriguing way.
Whistle and I'll Come to You was the first adaptation, directed by Jonathan Miller in 1968.
It's very difficult to visualise James without being crass, because that's the whole thing with movies. They have to be literal, and the literalness, very often, in my view, kills the horror. It's too clunky. But there's something about Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Love, which keeps that sort of impressionistic, suggestive thing of what the spooks are. Although it is a sort of psychological interpretation of M.R. James and of the type of that researcher from Oxbridge, I think it's quite brilliant, actually.
He was committed to, making your flesh creep. And, he did that with, little fluttering strange shapes and delicate hints of terror. But, he would also rip people's heads off and step on their eyeballs if he thought that was what was going to get the best effect. My pick is Lost Hearts, which is among the most gruesome, but it's also among the most conceptually disturbing, because it's about, predation on children.
Help with the bags, help with the bags.
Lost Hearts was one of James's first published stories, and played on the terror of a young orphan invited to live with a strange uncle.
You don't remember me? Well,
even the scene with the children, or the little boys travelling to his uncle's in the train, and the ghost of the hurdy-gurdy boys waving from the field is so terrifying.
Oh, steady, man, steady, steady.
That image of the two gypsy children sitting there just looking at you with this hurdy-gurdy music on the soundtrack. I've seen it once in 1970-something, and I can't get it out of my head.
James's interest in ghosts started at a young age. The son of a minister, he spent his early life at the remote Livermere Rectory in Suffolk. It was here that he read the Gothic tales of Sheridan Le Fanu, and was said to have been haunted by what he thought he saw from his bedroom window. A face looking back at him through a hole in a gate. Whether or not he actually saw anything, the image stayed with him throughout his life. As well as being a highly suggestible child, James was also extremely precocious.
His sister remembers him sitting up in bed when he was very young, when he was ill, reading a large Dutch Bible, presumably of the 17th century. So that just shows you he was an unusual child.
This kind of aptitude won him a scholarship to Eton in 1876.
He could read ancient Ethiopic when he went to Eton, for instance, which I don't suspect many children of 12 or 13 can do. So he was an unusual boy, but he was very sociable as well. He had a lot of friends. He joined all the usual Eton societies. Eton became the place he gave his heart to. If you had to name a place where M.R. James felt at home, it would be Eton.
It's an Anglican, rural, bookish, antiquarian atmosphere that he's brought up in. And in one sense, he never left that environment. He moved from very institution to institution where he could replicate the environment he grew up in.
James left Eton in 1882 to study classics at King's College, Cambridge, and ended up spending most of his life there. The student would become a fellow, dean, and vice-chancellor, positions that allowed him to indulge his scholarly interests as one of Europe's leading experts on medieval art, apocryphal literature, and classical archaeology. James drew on his knowledge of ancient texts and manuscripts to create the mysterious documents and lost artifacts that his ghost stories often hinge on, and which suck his characters and readers into a dark, supernatural world.
They contribute to the realism because, of course, the feeling is, well, this book must exist. This manuscript, these crowns, they're the kind of thing that would exist.
Habent investimentes suis scripturum quam nemo novit. They have on their vestments a writing which no man knoweth.
Well, if that's a text, it's not very edifying.
Oh, not all texts are edifying.
They would be in some ancient abbey or buried in a barrow in the ground. James says, of course, that everything like that he invented, and I'm sure he did, but he knew that there were such things, perhaps with no occult implications, but there were such things about, and therefore he convinces us.
Although the fragments from the past add realism, it is James's eerie use of landscape which puts the shiver into his stories. He grew up near the bleak North Sea coastline of Suffolk, and it is the brooding mood of these lonely places that haunts his writing.
I think the landscape around him is, had an effect. I mean, it is a very evocative landscape, and I think it has things in it that can evoke these kinds of feelings. He wrote poems about the local landscape in which he introduced these feelings of kind of something beyond, if not the supernatural, something that might take one to a position where this landscape evokes the supernatural.
He seems to have a relationship with the countryside that his characters don't have with each other. He's haunted by a sense of what, Britain is. And Britain is, of course, one of the most blood-soaked islands in the world, isn't it, with thousands of years of strange, violent history. And I think that's important to James too.
There was a wonderful romantic element of a lost England that when you read it now you pine for, and that clearly was something that M.R. James felt himself. You can feel his nostalgia even at a time when I presume that he thought that was disappearing.
Like James himself, his characters love to wander the blustery eastern seaboard of England in search of clues to the past. In Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, Parkin, a college professor, goes on holiday to Suffolk. When he unearths an old whistle, his inquisitive mind takes over.
Find those keepers?
But as in much of James's work, too much curiosity proves a very bad thing.
One of the messages of all horror or ghost stories is, step off the path and the monster will get you. And that seems to be a big theme in James's work. When you want to know something, maybe something you shouldn't know, and that seems to be the sin, as it were, that brings the scary stuff down on its protagonists. It's that need to peer into the darkness a bit more. And, of course, what happens is something peers back and usually bites back as well.
The plight of his overzealous characters could be taken as a warning not to ask too many questions in areas best left unexplained. James, by his own admission, was a Victorian, ill at ease with living in the 20th century.
M.R. James, in his life as Dean and Provost at King's College, Cambridge, is fantastically resistant to change, to the tendencies of modernity that were going on all around him. In his life at Cambridge, he voted against any development that seemed to change the status quo. Voted degrees for women, new disciplines, even a performance of Elgar's Dream of Gerontius in King's Chapel, which he thought was too papistical and so on. He votes against all that. Stop the world, I want to get off.
James despised science. Perhaps it threatened his faith, or more likely because it challenged convention.
Science probably was a threat because with the pace of scientific progress in the 20th century, it accelerated so fast. And it goes back to Hamlet, there are more things in heaven and earth than I dreamt of in your philosophy. I think that's the great message of the ghost stories.
Despite clinging to the past, James could not keep the modern world at bay. The First World War devastated a generation of young men, and James's Cambridge was stripped of its youth. The decimation of the officer class meant that many of James's friends and students never returned. Cambridge was never quite the same for James after the war, and he retreated from the university altogether, taking up the post of provost at Eton, where the library offered him a sanctuary of sorts.
And you can detect in his writing his irritation with the modern world. It comes through many, many times. He's irritated with, loud, noisy, uneducated people. He's irritated with the modern trappings of life. So we see this very solipsistic world. It's all about him. It's all about this tiny little world, and intrusions upon it are of no interest to him.
A warning to the curious, written during his time back at Eton, is perhaps James's most telling title.
Along the coast of Norfolk, there persists an ancient legend. It is said that in the Dark Ages, when the Vikings were a constant scourge, the 3 royal crowns of Anglia were hidden in the ground.
The central character, Paxton, goes in search of hidden treasure. Delve into the storyline, and James's motives are clear.
Anyone who overreaches, anyone who's too ambitious, anyone who wants to get to the top of the tree by cutting corners in their research, you get slapped down.
I suppose that has real biblical connotations, a real biblical allegory with the tree of knowledge and reaching up for the apple and mankind's fall as soon as they ask too many questions. And if so, I mean, what a subtle way to do it. You know, just don't ask questions or the old things will come and get you.
What happened, Paxton? What was it?
It was here, you see. He came to take it back.
Probably what gives the stories their edge is this kind of tension between what he believed in personally and this other world that perhaps he had had a glimpse of and which he could never quite dismiss. So I think you have this kind of creative tension.
I hope the Grove's destruction put an end to the practice of such superstitious foolery.
So far as I know, the old customs have died.
When M.R. James died in 1936, he was celebrated for his contribution to academic knowledge. But it was what he did in his spare time that has had the more lasting influence. His storytelling hobby shaped modern horror as profoundly as that of any other writer.
I think the domestic setting of his horror was incredibly influential today. Take Stephen King and all those authors where the devil's in the central heating unit, not in a Bavarian castle, not in the Transylvanian Alps. You know, you don't have to have fairyland anymore. You can actually have it in suburbia. That's very James.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
Everyone who came after him simply tried to imitate what he had done. So they stand alone. They are literally in a class of their own. And to that degree, they're still worth reading because they evoke so much. They evoke a completely vanished world. And they still can give you a little kick.
I could probably read James if I was lying on a sunny beach, but not within 4 walls and never, never after dark.
Stay here for a brand new adaptation of M.R. James' chilling story, Number 13, BBC4, next.